Bantay Kita will be presenting a report that tackles the current status of civic space in the country. As we know, civic space is the bedrock of any open and democratic society. Sabi nga ni Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2019, she said that civil society participation is the lifeblood of any healthy democracy and society. When civil society channels flow freely, it means vibrant debate, freedom of thought and opinion, and public engagement in policy. The objectives of this event are first to present the key findings of the report on civic space on extractive industry and natural resource governance and its importance in the current PHEITI validation process. And second, to share the processes undertaken, the challenges, and popularize the current civic space situation of the environment and human rights defenders involved in the extractive industry and natural resource governance issues in the Philippines. And now to present to us the context and the processes in producing the civic space report, may I call on Ms. Ange Dacanay, the Deputy National Coordinator of Bantay Kita, and this will be followed by the presentation of the key results and findings of the report to be given to us by Sir Vince Lasatin, the National Coordinator of Bantay Kita.
Thank you, Ms. Bon. So I'll go straight ahead on the report on civic space and natural resource governance in the Philippines. So as mentioned earlier, this was a shadow report from Bantay Kita that we submitted to the validation team to the EITI International Secretariat. On the background, we were in discussion with PWIP on why we needed this shadow report or the civic space report, because we have seen a worsening global environment for many CSOs, not only in the Philippines but around the world, and it's been a challenge for EITI to uphold its commitment to safeguard CSOs and its engagement in the EITI platform. In 2017, the Philippines has also been named as the first country to receive the satisfactory progress. That's why we wanted to use or to leverage that and see how the civic space or the state of human rights in the Philippines is now in 2021. So this research aims to provide information for the EITI validation of the Philippines. So we submitted this as a document to the validation committee as well. And then we documented and analyzed the Philippine civic space from January 2017 to March 2021 only. So this was the timeline for the validation of the Philippines for this year, for 2021. And then we also offered recommendations on how the Philippines, or maybe also other countries, on how we can push for civic space reforms in the whole agenda of EITI. So I just want to delve into the research design of the project. First is that we assess the situation of the civic space in the Philippines using, of course, the EITI validation framework on civil society engagement. We have 5 different benchmarks in that framework. So first is the expression of civil society, the operation, association, engagement, and access to decision making. So it has sets of questions on to know how's the status or situation of the civic space in the Philippines. And then second is that it also addresses the key issues identified in the EITI standard and protocol on civil society engagement. And also we used the new validation guideline, which was only released last year, late last year, 2020. So it was a bit also new to us because the Philippines is the first country to be validated under the new validation guideline. So just the methodologies that we used for the research or the study, of course, we reviewed related literature and policies that were released from January 2017 until March 2021. We had focus group discussions online and offline. depending on the area. And then, of course, we had key informant interviews with some of the national CSOs working on natural resource governance and human rights in general. On the research sites, we chose 4 community areas with this criteria. First is the nature of mining or the landscape. So whether it's operating or under rehabilitation or expired contracts with the mining companies. And then, of course, the level of engagement of the civil society or the NGOs with EITI and other natural resource governance issues. We also had the level of community or grassroots organization vis-a-vis the natural resource governance. So we had 4 areas which were Palawan, Nueva Vizcaya, Antique, and South Cotabato. If you can see, Palawan, that's operational mines. And then we had Nueva Vizcaya or Oceana Gold, which were under negotiation for their contract renewal. But back in 2020, early 2021, they had an expired contract with the Philippine government. And Antique for Semerara for coal mining, which is also operational. For South Cotabato, pending contract and of course pending social license from the local communities and government in South Cotabato. And then we have key informant interviews with national CSOs. We had, I think, 3 KIIs with NGOs, CSOs working on natural resource governance and also human rights. And then I just want to also share the challenges that we faced during the implementation of the study. First, of course, is that we had a very limited time because we were waiting for the final schedule from the IS on the validation of the Philippines. Originally, we were scheduled for the validation October 2020, but because of the new validation guide, we were waiting for the final decision and when it's going to be implemented. So we were advised that the Philippines will start by March. So we only had, I think, total of 3 months to execute the plan and the study as well. And of course, the limited mobility because of COVID-19. Online interviews cannot stand in for the personal interactions of face-to-face FGDs or interviews. So some of the areas like Semerara Antique, they had face-to-face, but in some areas such as Palawan and South Cotabato, they had to do phone interviews and online interviews, which was very challenging also to get results from the respondents. And then we also have faced challenges from the research sites having intermittent connectivity for them to transmit the interview results and even the raw data of videos and transcriptions from their area. And then lastly, since we had very limited time, it was challenging to have to do translations from local dialect to English that we had to translate it to the report on the shadow report that's to be submitted to the EITI International. I think that's from my end on the intro, and then we can go directly to the results to surveys.
Thanks, Ange. I'll present the shadow report, and Ange has covered some of this already, so I'll skip the slides. So the context of the report is, as Ange mentioned, it's really part of the validation process. We were the first country to receive satisfactory progress in our last validation back in 2017. And then there were new guidelines that were created at the end of 2020. And the Philippines, as we understand it, is the first country to be evaluated under these new guidelines. And it covers, of course, from 2017 to 2021. And of course, in the context of the Philippines and many countries around the world, there are concerns about shrinking civic space and democratic rights. In the EITI document, when they were reviewing the validation process, one of the things that stood out was really the need to review the civil society protocol and whether or not the methodology in assessing was adequate for safeguarding civic space. So I think this is something that was highlighted when they reviewed the validation process. And of course, it's of particular concern to us this afternoon, this evening. So the impetus for the report first was an enhanced importance on civil society participation under the new validation guidelines. Second was a desire to try to widen the definition of civil society participation because we see it as being very narrowly focused on EITI, and it's important we believe, to look at it from a broader perspective. And as such, Philippines actually is a test case for the new validation guidelines. And of course, there was a desire to capture the recent narrowing of civil and political rights in the Philippines and try to show how the larger context in the Philippines affects the more specific case of the space for natural resource governance and EITI in specific. So our report is called The Rising Tide, and as Ange mentioned, we submitted it to the validation committee for their consideration as they were looking at requirement 1.3, which is civil society participation. We start off by acknowledging that the Philippine CSO community is quite vibrant. It's well recognized around the world. In the 2019 CSO Sustainability Index, Philippines, along with Timor-Leste, is ranked among the most, I guess, healthy environment for CSOs compared to our Asian neighbors. This chart is a little confusing. The shorter the bar, meaning that the closer the bar is to the left, the better. And the longer the bar, the more the bar approaches the right, the worse it is. So you see the Philippines there with Timor-Leste as having the shortest bar. But the real story is that the trend has been declining since 2016. And while the overall index has declined, so have some of the individual components, such as the legal environment, advocacy, service provision, and even the public image. And we'll talk about a little bit about the public image of CSOs a little later. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing this slide. In the sustainability report, they noted that state harassment of CSOs, human rights defenders, and activists, etc., had increased, and that President Rodrigo Duterte perceives human rights activists and CSOs as critics of his public pronouncements and policies. In addition, the president had verbally attacked major media companies, and in fact, since the 2019 report was written, one of the major broadcast networks was actually denied the renewal of its franchise. So it's now off the air. In addition, Civicus had downgraded Philippines civil society civic space from obstructed to oppressed. In its report, it said that the Duterte government has incrementally chipped away at civic freedom since it came into power in 2016. And there has been systematic intimidation, attacks, and vilification of civil society and activists. So this is really the broader context in which we find ourselves in 2021. And so the question for the assessment is whether this larger context has affected civil society engagement in issues relating to natural resource governance in general and the EITI in particular. So what impact have the larger issues had on the natural resource governance and EITI space? Just to briefly recall that according to the EITI protocol, participation of civil society is fundamental to achieving the objectives of EITI. So it's critical, first of all, that sectors are participating, but certainly very important for civil society to be able to participate freely in EITI. And as Ange mentioned, there are 5 dimensions to the EITI protocol for civil society engagement: expression, operation, association, engagement, and access to decision-making. And all of these were looked at in our report, but I won't go into details into each one of those. The thing that we sort of struggled with is that when EITI talks about civil society engagement, it's relatively narrow. According to the documentation, references to civil society representatives will include civil society representatives who are substantively involved in the EITI process. And it goes on to talk about the various processes. And we struggled with this because we thought that it was important to look at the total context in which civil society operates in a country. Many civil society organizations do not work exclusively in the natural resource governance space or the EITI space. Many times they are human rights organizations or environmental organizations. And so EITI, or the natural resource governance space, is just part of what they do. And it's important, we think, to look at the whole picture, the context in which these organizations operate. So what we're looking at really is, what were the changes since our last validation in 2017? How did civil society fare in these areas from January 2017 to March of 2021? And since the last validation in 2017, are there changes in civic space? And if there are they significant enough to affect the country's standing in the eyes of EITI? Or are these changes unaffected by, and thus have nothing to do with, the larger question of democracy? And so one of the first things we did is look at the policy context. What has changed since 2017? And what we saw was what we call a trifecta of factors. First was institutional capture. Second, anti-terror legislation. And third, a culture of violence and impunity. As regards to institutional capture, there are several issuances made by government agencies that had direct impact on civil society and the way it operates. We had, for example, a memorandum circular coming from the Securities and Exchange Commission. This was Memorandum Circular 2018-15. And this was designed ostensibly to protect nonprofit organizations from money laundering and terrorist financing abuse. The problem with something like this, for example, is that it requires NGOs to identify the funders and addresses and individuals that are funding NGOs. And this is a rather, we find to be a very invasive requirement of NGOs. The Department of Interior and Local Governments issued a series of memoranda circular since 2017, namely Memoranda Circular 2018-89, 2019-72, and 2021-012. And all of these have to do with registering CSOs and the way NGOs or CSOs can engage with government. And again, many of these memoranda circular, while on the surface seem to have good intentions, the net result is that they require registering of NGOs and CSOs with local governments, and more worrisome is to get that NGOs and CSOs must get clearances from the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police. And this is something that had never been done before. And then lastly is the DFA Note Verbal 2021-0592. And this was an issuance from the Department of Foreign Affairs that required foreign funders to register with the, I'm not sure if register is word, but to make known to the Department of Finance that it was funding local NGOs. So again, these are what we consider somewhat invasive and cumbersome rules and regulations being imposed upon NGOs and CSOs. The second in the trifecta is anti-terror legislation. And the most prominent of these is the anti-terror law, which went into effect in the middle of 2020. Some of the more egregious provisions in the anti-terror law is one, it allows for the detention of individuals without a warrant for as long as 24 days. It has a very vague and ambiguous definition of terrorism, and has expanded the power of the Anti-Terrorism Council. Just 2 days ago, the Supreme Court released a media advisory saying that the Supreme Court had made a decision on petitions with regard to the unconstitutionality of the anti-terror law. And according to the media advisory, and I haven't had the benefit of reading the actual decisions themselves because they haven't been released, but according to the media advisory, a couple of the provisions were identified as being unconstitutional. First was this definition of terrorism, which they thought was overly broad. So they had to pull back and be a little more narrow in defining terrorism. And second was the expanded power of the Anti-Terrorism Council. I think they did identify one of the provisions there to be unconstitutional. But all the other provisions were deemed constitutional, and most especially this detention without warrant for 24 days. And again, something very worrisome. And then there was the issuance of Executive Order 70, which created the National Task Force. Excuse me, I always forget what the ELCAC stands for. Something about local communist and something. But this is a task force that, since it came into being, has been used to accuse individuals and organizations of being communists, of being subversives, and what we call red tagging. And I think this is this red tagging is what has led to perhaps the decline in the public perception of a lot of NGOs and CSOs. And lastly is the culture of violence and impunity. In 2019, Global Witness ranked the Philippines as the second most dangerous dangerous place for environmental defenders. More than a third, or 16 out of 43 of the deaths, were among activists in extractive sectors. Nearly half of those killings were carried out by state forces. So this would be Armed Forces of the Philippines or Philippine National Police. And of the majority of the killings remain unsolved. So certainly we are operating in an environment of impunity and under this culture of violence. And of course, we couple this with President Duterte's war on drugs, which from practically the very first day of his inauguration back in 2016 was characterized by killings and violence. So what are some of the key findings? I'll categorize the key findings into three broad areas. The first broad area is fear, intimidation, harassment, and chilling effect. I'll go over these one by one. In general, there is a fear in publicly expressing opinions and positions against the government, although in local landscapes, this pertains more to the local government. There is now fear in holding assemblies and protests, and respondents experience vilification for expressing their opinions, not only from the state, but from community members as well, online as well as offline. The respondents have clearly felt the chilling effect of the Anti-Terrorism Act. There are experiences of intimidation, harassment, and violent dispersal. And in general, there's now fear in convening meetings and gatherings. Most respondents believe that they are being surveilled. And in general, respondents believe that the media had been persecuted and vilified. And in one landscape, a journalist had even been killed. So certainly, under the current environment, there is this climate of fear and intimidation that is being felt by communities, by civil society organizations, by community-based organizations that are all working in the natural resource governance space, and in many cases, in the EITI space as well. The second category of findings has to do with the low awareness or lack of access to information regarding EITI, Philippine EITI. So in general, respondents were not aware of EITI. In terms of access to information, including on EITI, there is difficulty in accessing information, and the government, including EITI, are not proactive about making information available. Participants from people's organizations have difficulty in engaging because of the language barrier and the technical nature of EITI, and data are inaccessible is a majority sentiment of the respondents. In the data that are available, there are gaps, such as the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples data on royalties for Indigenous peoples, for example. So there is a general lack of access to information. And as it has been pointed out many times, communities find the information highly technical, and therefore inaccessible. And then there are just sort of other findings. Many communities are felt left out of hearings and consultations, and are only informed after the fact. There is, as of yet, no difficulty in accessing funding, but new circulars might change that. And there is a lot of confusion surrounding competing interests among local tribal leaders, community leaders, and the local governments as regards to mining. And so it creates a bit of a chaotic situation on the ground in many communities. So those are the basic categories of findings. So what are the recommendations? First is for EITI to expand the parameters of its protocol and civil society engagement, to be able to assess, in addition to engagement in EITI and natural resource governance, the state of civic space in general. Again, we think this is very important because what happens in society at large does affect many times the ability of civil society organizations and communities to engage in a free and open manner. And again, this is something that we point out in the report. Second is to expand the EITI standard to include an assessment of the democratic space itself. Again, we don't operate in a vacuum, and it's important to look at the context in which many of the CSOs operate to understand what impact it may or may not have on CSO engagement in EITI. Third is for EITI to expand its definition of civil society to include a variety of actors, including informal associations, among others. The next set of recommendations revolve around trying to get EITI into the hands of, or in front of communities and make it more accessible. So we talk about, for example, an information drive to be conducted by EITI for communities. Second, for EITI activities to include more representatives from the communities. For EITI to promote participation of civil society in the management of resources by local governments. For EITI and more solidarity groups to establish a regular presence in the communities. Access to data, especially on benefits, including royalties, should be made more available to communities and in a format that communities can access. While providing information online is a great way to distribute information, many times communities don't have access to online platforms. And so we have to consider that as well. The government must facilitate discussions and disseminate information on the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights and a legally binding instrument to regulate transnational corporations. So that is a brief overview of the report, the shadow report that we submitted to the EITI Validation Committee. So I'll stop here and turn it over back to Juan.
Thank you, Sir Vince. So now we will